Okay, in case some of you have just joined us, this is Issues in Biotechnology, the way we work with life. And this is cross-listed across these different departments and also presented online as BCH 190. We are in the first section of this course called The Mechanics of DNA, What is Life? Presenting a foundation first for what is life and how we work with it before we go on to the second section, which will be devoted to the applications in biotechnology. So, as promised in my syllabus, what we want to cover in the first part of this set of lectures concerns the trends, patterns, and relationships in biology. What are some of the commonalities that we observe about life? I've already stated in the first lecture that it's difficult to define life, and lots of people have tried previous to this class. And every time you do it, you can almost always come up with some exception. You can make a list of attributes which you think define life. And sooner or later, you will discover an organism which escapes your definition. So what is life? We will continue to address this question because, as I said, it's more complicated than probably you thought before you started taking this class. So far, in the last lecture, we demonstrated that in part, life contains information, and that part of that dynamic is the transfer of that information out to function, which would be proteins. So there is this flow of information which characterizes life on this planet. Mostly that information is contained in deoxyribonucleic acids, in the bases that make up the sequence of DNA, which we call genes, when it's transferred to an RNA and then decoded into proteins. There are 20 different amino acids on this planet that are used to make proteins in that code. Realize that there are more than 20 amino acids, but there are characteristically only 20 amino acids. Typically, there are some exceptions, but typically 20 amino acids which code for proteins, whether they're in bacteria or a human being. And the code for them is the same. ATG spells for methionine, and no matter what organism. This means that I can take his hemoglobin gene and it will be decoded in a corn plant because ATG is universal. The language is the same. And this flow of information is consistent whether you're a virus or a pea plant. We described also that there are two major groups of life described as prokaryotes, the bacteria, which outnumber the eukaryotes by far, and they're decidedly more ancient. They've been here for about 3.2 billion years or so. And they have a very simple structure, but they are by no means simple. We compared these to eukaryotic cells, described here as plant and animal cells, the plant on the right and the animal on the left, and you will see that they share many of the same internal features in common. They both have a central nucleus which contains most of the DNA, but not all of it. That there are two structures in plants that are bound by double membranes, a mitochondria, which is involved in respiration, breaking down sugar into chemical energy ATP, and chloroplasts, which conduct photosynthesis and are also double membrane bound. Animal cells lack chloroplasts and hence do not perform photosynthesis, so all animal cells are dependent on plants for their survival. And both of those organelles, mitochondria and chloroplasts, contain their own DNA, which led Lynn Margulis to come up with the endosymbiont hypothesis, describing that an ancient eukaryote engulfed an ancestral prokaryote, which came to live within it, to eventually become a mitochondria or a chloroplast. Realize something. There are mitochondria in virtually every cell of your body. That would make mitochondria the most successful organism on the planet. There are more mitochondria in you than there are human cells in you. So this organism now is a part of all of these other organisms. We don't know how many times this actually happened. Was there just one ancestral event that gave rise to all mitochondria? Usually we see in nature that something did not happen only once, but that's not outside the realm of possibility. And the same thing would go for chloroplasts in plants. An ancient blue-green algal cell that could perform photosynthesis was engulfed by another cell, which obviously then had the advantage of performing photosynthesis, giving rise to all higher plants. And every higher plant now, well, not every, most higher plants have chloroplasts in them. Here's a review out of your text of the different organelles, so-called, the different compartments inside of cells and their functions. You can review those, but one of the features that you find that is striking is that life compartmentalizes. We all compartmentalize, or else what would happen? But one of the features of life is that it's biochemically compartmentalizing these different functions. So what is life? One thing that we can notice about it already is that it's characterized as a community of information, a sharing of information with interactive variation, selected by the environment for survival, and favored by a division of labor. I show in this picture here a colony of Volvox cells, which have these large cells and these smaller cells. Each one of them do different functions. And what you will see is another characteristic of eukaryotic life is this division of labor, even between the sexes in males and females. So how did this all happen? Let's just review this and fast forward, where if we go with Einstein and his explanation, and he was right about at least a few things, this universe is about 13.2, 13.6 billion years old. And sometime after that, our galaxy formed, our solar system formed, and this Earth started to cool down around 4.5 billion years ago. At around 3.2 billion years, 3.6 billion years, simple molecules formed out of carbon. Probably amino acids, probably nucleotide bases, other nitrogenous bases formed with carbon. These experiments have been replicated. So not only is this merely a hypothesis, but you could go into the laboratory and design experiments that would replicate a primitive Earth. Sometime after that, and so what? You have this stew of organic molecules. That's really in itself not that interesting until some of these start to polymerize. And with that polymerization, things get interesting when those molecules can self-replicate. If you just have a bunch of molecules sitting around, who really cares? This really is not all that interesting until that information can copy. Now, if they can copy, this all of a sudden sets up a competition for resources. If an organism or any piece of information, whether it's a virus on your computer or whatever you have, starts to compete for resources, it will replicate. And that replication process is favored over just a bunch of molecules sitting around, you see? So replication was the driving force of life. So DNA replication was something that happened later, But the main driving hypothesis now is that life on this planet started off not with DNA, but RNA. And it's this RNA where it was able to copy. DNA was somewhat later, probably, because of its stability. And these copying molecules then were favored if they became encapsulated or compartmentalized away from its environment. And how would this happen? Perhaps lipid bubbles formed in waves. There are many mechanistic ways you can think about how this might occur. But compartmentalization was another primitive factor that had to drive replication. If you had stuff inside that was different than stuff outside, you had an advantage. So advantages were set up. And if this were able to divide, now you could share that replication within those two structures. Then eventually proteins formed. Photosynthesis was a key event. Before photosynthesis, there was no oxygen on this planet. All oxygen on this planet comes from the splitting of water. You split water, you make hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen, by the way, is toxic, so we compartmentalize it by using mitochondria. So these organisms for respiration and photosynthesis came at about the same time. Locomotion, the ability to move, also became important. Hey, my environment is pretty crappy over here, but over there I can get something to eat. That was a good day. Being able to share information from one organism to another, enhancing the variation between information, caused information sharing and variation, and survival was enhanced. So, prokaryotic organisms came first, and that ability to share information through a primitive sex increased the amount of information variation. Then eventually, we believe now that Lynn Margulis was correct. There's information piled high around the room that mitochondria are ancient ancestors of prokaryotes. They have similar DNA, similar protein structures, and so on. So eukaryotic cells eventually developed, and now things start happening rather rapidly. You can use this color scheme in this slide to show where you are on the time scale. So roughly at about 2 billion years or so, we start to have multicellular organisms, and then a very interesting event occurs with meiosis. Being able to make eggs and sperm creates increased variation. So sex gets better. And after this, a central nervous system, the ability for organisms to create electric potentials that drive signals in both plants and animals. Multicellularity eventually gives rise to complex body plans. In plants, they become terrestrial. Animals, complex organisms typically with bilateral symmetry. Skeletons, behavioral networks in insects like ants. Primitive plants make seeds, storage units that can communicate and save their information from one generation to the next. And eventually, flowers form. Mammals, roughly, dinosaurs, you know, are about 200, 250 million years ago. Mammals come after that. Birds after that, somewhat at the same time as mammals, but just a little bit before. So we get mammals, and then eventually humans in the last fraction of time here. So if you take that time frame I just gave you and call it a football field, humans appear roughly at about the last inch, I think, to the goal line. So all this time, just put it in perspective. Humans have been here for a flash. That's it. Brand new. Okay, that's kind of how we got here. And much of that can be supported by hypothesis making and testing in the laboratory. Obviously, people weren't here to verify that. Some of it can be verified through fossil records, Before that, some of it can be deduced by chemical experiments in the laboratory. And the best information we have now is that replication of information began with the RNA, and then DNA later, and then cells. Most biologists would agree on this. After DNA, all of this is abundantly obvious. You could argue with me about that, but that might take several cups of coffee and some hours. But let's look at some trends, patterns, and relationships on life on this planet. And if you think that life might be different out there, I've already made some pretty serious arguments that some of the constraints that we have here are likely the same constraints out there. So, it took 3.2 billion years to get to a human that could actually discuss this. Give or take about, 150,000 years or so, which is nothing, right? So it took 3.2 billion years to get to this podium, right? So if the same thing is going on out there, wouldn't you expect that it would take about that same frame of time if you had an environment that was somewhat like this, based on a carbon chemistry that required water? Kind of the similar physics must be involved, right? And we haven't discovered yet how to make a spaceship to get out of here and travel at better than light speed. Just to put things into context about my question about whether aliens had been here or not and visited, that's quite a trick. So what is this? What is this stuff we call life? A child came to me and said, "What is this grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How can I answer the child? I don't know what it is any more than he. Read Walt Whitman. Gives me chills, actually. Leaves of Grass. Whitman is great as a comment on today's culture, no matter where you pick it up. Trends, patterns, and relationships in biology. I think these are 16 things you might want to know about life. I don't mean that this defines it or even fully characterizes it, but these are 16 things that life on this planet and probably elsewhere share in common. You can look at Malin Hoagland's book, edited or illustrated with Bert Dodson on the way life works. I'm not sure this book is still in print, but some of the illustrations that I show in this class come from this book and some of their ideas. So one of the things you might want to realize is that life uses small things and builds bigger things. This is kind of typical. Look at my description of a cell already. There are many smaller components inside of bigger components. Kind of like that Russian doll thing. So that small things are made of yet smaller things. And that we have small communities of cells, like our taste buds and our tongues, that work together. And that cells make organs. While cells make tissues, tissues make organs, organs make organisms. So that even Darwin commented on this feature about life, saying that each living creature must be looked at as a microcosm, a little universe formed of a host of self-propagating organisms, inconceivably minute and as numerous as the stars in the heaven. This is a good observation, and he was characteristically a pretty observant guy. Each living creature viewed as a microcosm. I'm going to get back to this. You yourself are not just a human. You have mitochondria in you. Perhaps we ourselves are like mitochondria in a bigger microcosm. Didn't Dr. Seuss do something like this? Horton Hears a Who. Life, I already said this one in a previous lecture, assembles itself in chains. So we have information, but we have chained molecules. We have carbohydrates, sugars that make up polymers to make long chains of molecules we call complex carbohydrates. We have amino acids that in a sequence make different proteins. We have bases and nucleic acids that spell for genes or make the structure of DNA. So life assembles itself in chains, And difference in these symbols become information. A's, T's, G's, and C's in a sequence contain information. So I gave the example previously that dots and dashes gave rise to the Morse code in a telegraph in the 1800s, and that allowed people to communicate long distance during the 1800s. Oh, by the way, sidebar issue. Did you know that this week, a very important date in American history, September 17th, 150 years ago, you're nodding, the Battle of Antietam in the Civil War. 23,000 people died in one day. And 5 days later, the Emancipation Proclamation. Anyway, I didn't mean to divert, but it was in the days of the telegraph and being able to communicate. Subsequent to that, we had digital information, and look at how fast now that development has accelerated. From the 1940s and 1950s, using zeros and ones, only two symbols. Look at what we have now. Just in your lifetime, just in the last 10 years, what's happened is amazing. And it will continue to develop like this exponentially. If you think that what you have now, in terms of your computer or your smartphone, is the end, it will just continue exponentially. It's hard to even imagine what will be 5 years from now. Facebook will likely be obsolete, I hope. Our language itself, with 26 different characters, look at what we're able to do. So, now is the winter of our disco. Or think about what we can convey in ideas. And this is actually why I put poetry into this class. What does poetry convey that is outside of the human language? Replication of information, therefore, is essential to life. I would position also that learning and what you're doing now is very similar to that process. In fact, if not directly homologous, at least analogous to it. Learning. Every organism learns one way or another from its predecessor. If it doesn't, it does not contribute going forward. Over 99% of the species that have ever lived are now extinct. So, learning is essential to life. Life needs an inside and an outside. I mentioned that one of the earliest events was compartmentalization. This is essential for being able to sequester the stuff of life against the stuff out there and condense and concentrate it in a meaningful, practical way. But there's another aspect to compartmentalization that's also important. This has to come with a distinction between self and non-self. So the distinction between self and non-self must be ancient. Self being okay, non-self being not okay. So primitive defense mechanisms amongst cells must have developed very early. I mentioned in my example about DNA cloning that Boyer, Cohen, and Berg were working with enzymes that would cut DNA in specific places. Why would there be such a protein in the first place? Why would a bacteria have a protein that would recognize AATT and cut it there? Except if that bacteria didn't contain that sequence and it ever saw it from the outside, some invading virus, kaboom, it cuts it. There are mechanisms like this throughout life, where self is okay, non-self is not okay. Therein lies a problem, yes? Look at what societies around the planet struggle with in terms of xenophobia. Isn't this really an extrapolation of something very ancient in life itself? I'm okay, you're not okay, kind of thing? But life needs an inside and an outside. That's a characteristic pretty much of anything you would want to describe of as life on this planet. This is, in most cases, delineated using a so-called plasma membrane, which is a lipid bilayer in which floating are proteins which are able to communicate with the outside, deliver stuff from the outside to the inside and concentrate it, and actually push things out. So this is described in chapter 3 of your text, What is Life? And I will leave that description up to your text there, except to say that this molecule is not made by the cell physically the way I describe DNA replication. But this is formed by self-assembly, physics. If you take this phospholipid and shake it in water, since it has a hydrophobic head, meaning it will repel water, and a hydrophilic head drawn to water, and a hydrophobic tail that is resistant to water, it will physically organize in this lipid bilayer. And that's essentially what a membrane is and how it works by self-assembly. I'm going to get back to that characteristic about self-assembly and emergence and its importance in biology and life. But it's not just simply a lipid bilayer unto itself. Proteins embed within this due to their own chemistry. They float within this lipid bilayer. Some of them are decorated with carbohydrates that also contain information. Some of the information on there is used by cells to determine its age. So as these carbohydrates are decorating these proteins, these form the ability for cells to communicate with each other. They form recognition signals to which viruses can attack and invade cells. But membranes themselves are very complicated structures. So we have the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid, and we have ways of communicating with the outside of a cell and delivering things to the inside. Some of these might diffuse through a membrane, as these small molecules shown here on the left in terms of passive transport. And water can also do this. We have also molecules that move across from a higher to a lower concentration by facilitated diffusion, where molecules move typically through a carrier molecule, a protein in the membrane, as shown by this pore on the right side of that slide. Active transport uses chemical energy to drive materials inside or outside of a cell against the concentration gradient. And we have transmission of viruses and other particles that can recognize certain receptors on the outside of cells. For example, shown here is the HIV virus, which recognizes CD4 markers on the outside of T4 lymphocytes. So the HIV coat protein is very good at recognizing CD4 proteins and using that as a port of entry into T4 lymphocytes, where then it replicates. So life needs an inside and an outside, and the ability to recognize self from non-self. See, self, I can recognize self and cells can stick together. This is good. We have multicellularity. We have division of labor. I can have eye cells that are doing different things than liver cells. So self from non-self is important, and it's facilitated by these membranes and these proteins that can communicate. Also, what you recognize is that life uses few themes to generate many variations. This will seem contradictory, but there are more beetle species than any other animal that I know of, roughly about 300,000 beetles, and they all have basically one thing in common: they're beetles, but they share a common body plan which defines their beetleness. But moreover, what you'll end up seeing is that this is reiterated even down to the molecular level in genetics. Themes are reiterated. So a copy of one gene might be shared in many different organisms over and over. Or a body plan might be shared amongst beetles as being successful to whatever it is that a beetle does in all of those different environments. So tremendous variation with color, ecology, and proportion, yet the pattern and relationships that drive that underlying genetics and development, and I'll get to that in another lecture about development, and hopefully this will make some sense. But variation ensures success, yes? Life has poured itself into every crack and crevice on this planet. And if you're a beetle of one sort that is successful in one environment, and that environment either changes or it's outcompeted by something else, variation ensures that that species will continue. And this is what biological success is defined as. Not success like, oh, how much money you make, but biological success is continuance of a species. You gotta get your head around that a little bit. What does survival of the fittest mean? I don't care how fit you are, that doesn't matter. It's the population of humans that matter and whether that genetics goes on. I'll get to that in a minute. So variation ensures success. Richard Dawkins, in The Selfish Gene, has an interesting hypothesis. I'd highly recommend this book, just as a philosophical point of view. The book, The Selfish Gene, describes that replication is the driving force behind life. I already said that. That once a DNA molecule can replicate, replication is the driving force. And that DNA replication is what's important. So DNA has eventually resulted in all of these different vesicles that carry it in order to ensure its replication. Now I'm getting into Dawkins-esque kind of point of view. So a human then is nothing more than a bag of seawater used by DNA to get itself over land and replicate. Very Dawkins, you see. Kind of pessimistic maybe too. But see, life then is maybe DNA's way of ensuring that replication will continue. Whether it's a jade plant, or a frog, or a human, DNA will replicate. And it's using these different vehicles in order to do so, according to Richard Dawkins. In some environment, life will survive. It has, and it will. Oh, why sex? Well, I've already described that sharing of information is important. Actually, you might answer this, why not? But why just two? If we think that sex increases variation in biology, wouldn't we think that 9 would do a better job? Why not 8 or 9? And why just 2 for everything? Pretty much. I don't know very many organisms that have more or less than 2. This also gets down to my other questions about bilateral symmetry. Why is there a left and a right? Why is there polarity, duality? To answer this question, one thing you can notice about this is its outcome, that it ensures genetic variation. And genetic variation in the sharing of information, if we go back to Dawkins, is what this is really about. All of you are unique. That's interesting. Why is that? Why wouldn't it be better if just like we had one really good plan and it all worked out just fine? You know? If it's all working, then why do we need all this variation? Life is ensuring success through variation. But don't get teleological on me on this. Sex enhances genetic variation by mixing of instructions, by combining and recreating new combinations and exchanging information. That's what sexual reproduction is involved with. So life encourages variety by combining information through the mechanisms of making gametes and recombining them. So making gametes, eggs and sperm, two vehicles, recombining through the process of meiosis to shuffle the deck. If you're 24,567 genes, that's pretty good for you. He's got another 24,567 genes. If we mix those up, we can combine those pairs. Now imagine a variation that you have just between those two. And how does it do this? Every single time you make a gamete, it's slightly different. Because the chromosomes from your mom and your dad that you have, the arms of those chromosomes can change places. Shown here in this slide is a recombination, a crossing over event, which means that every single sperm in you is slightly different. Every single egg you ever made is slightly different because of this. That's why your siblings all look different. That's why your children will all look different, unless they're twins. So let's go to Foxwoods for a minute. Given that you're 24,567 genes and you're 24,567 genes, let's think about if we just had 52 cards in a deck and shuffled them. That would produce 4 by 10 to the 24 of 52 card combinations. That's a pretty big number. So shuffling the deck and the genes the point I'm trying to make with this example is there's plenty of variation in this deck. Not only in this deck, but in every deck on the planet. Imagine that. Imagine the kinds of variation that you get genetically. Your 3 billion base pairs of DNA, shuffle that deck. And there's lots of ways to do it. It's not just the chromosome arms that are changing places. There are genes that get up and move. Barbara McClintock demonstrated this in 1929, won a Nobel Prize for it in 1984. Took them a long time to figure it out. But genes move. It's not just a linear sequence like a string of beads. Things get up and move and reinsert. That's another way of ensuring variation. Gene duplication. Chromosomes duplicate. Chromosomes change arms. So chromosomal arms can be exchanged in that process called recombination, and that further increases genetic variation. But all those different segments can change places. Some can duplicate. Genes can duplicate. I just want to set the stage with all of this for my discussion about evolution. There's plenty of variation here. Now you just need a filter on it. One of those filters would be sexual selection. Why do certain organisms choose a mate? Do you just think she's cute? Do you think he's got some other attribute? Why? Why? What is it about that? Well, variety's more than just the spice of life, it turns out. One of the things that you recognize as a hallmark of biological life, but certainly not unique, is that in many, many organisms, males produce a lot of gametes. Females produce few. So it becomes a sort of an example of resource allocation. I mean, if you do the math, human females produce maybe about 450, 500 eggs during your lifetime that are viable, 450, whereas a male might produce that many number of sperm while we're sitting here talking about it. So how that plays out biologically, sociologically, and in other ways, nesting behaviors in birds, all these types of things, right down to plants. resource allocation, survival of the replicant. Life organizes itself with information, making the parts that make the whole. I said that small parts combine to make the entire part. I wouldn't be here talking if not for all of the different components. But you can't describe me in terms of any one of my cells apart from the whole. So cooperation of the parts is essential. I'll get back to that. Okay, with all that variation, and you've copied your DNA many times while we've been sitting here, you probably have made some mistakes. Even some mistakes in gametes. An A went in where a T should have gone. Whether that's a somatic cell or a gamete. So, part of the variation is just explained by replication itself. Maybe 10 to the 5, 10 to the 6 times that a base pair is inserted, it's not the one that it should be. Therefore, variation. Some of this leads to disease. Some of it is silent. Some of it goes on. Some of it is important. But life creates with mistake and change and benefits from variation. A mistake for one organism also could be an advantage to another. Polar bears likely were derived from a bear that was brown. However, an advantage selected for by being white in an odd mutation allows this one to propagate. So biological change is already there. I can already look across this room and see it. Everybody is slightly different. You're already different. You didn't have to sit there and think about it. You're already different. You brought your difference into the room. You brought your difference into the life that you have. It's in your genes. It's already there. Therefore, biological change is not purposive. You didn't think about your variation. You can't. And you can't change it by your thoughts. Nothing can. This is profound. Because there is no teleology to phylogeny. Wow. What did he just say? I guarantee you if you say that at a dinner party, people will move away. But there is no teleology to phylogeny. Biological change cannot possibly be purposive. An organism does not say, oh, if I just had wings, I could fly. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Birds did not will themselves to have wings any more than a circus elephant willed itself to be adorable. That's ridiculous. So, a bird did not evolve feathers in order to fly. That sounds like a crazy statement, doesn't it? You might ask, well, Dr. Kausch, what did a bird evolve feathers to do? But I just mean to say this is a problem in your thinking. A bird did not evolve feathers in order to fly. That's ridiculous. A bird did not evolve feathers in order to fly any more than it evolved feathers to fill your down comforter. So what does this mean, really? Teleology is the study of design or purpose in natural phenomena. So there is no design or purpose to biological phylogeny is the history of an organism's development. So the evolutionary development or history of a species and its taxonomic grouping is what we call phylogeny. So this takes purpose out of the equation biologically. A biologist does not look at the shape of a leaf and say, what is the purpose of the shape of that leaf? No. What's the function of the shape of the leaf? Everything has a function, is selected for its functionality. It could not possibly be purposive. I know that's a tough one. So in amongst all of this, there must be change. What doesn't work in this environment will lose. How do I know that? 99% of the time in the history of this planet, that's been shown. 99% of all organisms that have ever existed do not exist today. Change. 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 We've already said that life occurs in water, and that water is rare in the universe. Most of biological materials dissolve in water, the universal solvent. It's highly polar, has low viscosity and high surface tension. A lot of hydrogen bonding, these weak bonds between water molecules, so that it makes water somewhat of a liquid crystal. These are all very strange properties for a liquid, but this also enables life on this planet. And that how water moves in and through biological life, the process called osmosis, as described also in your text in this week's reading assignment, is important to understand. Water is heavy silver over stone. Water is heavy silver over stone's refusal. It does not fall, it flows, it fills every crevice, every fault of the stone, every hollow. River does not run. River presses its heavy silver self down into stone, and stone refuses. What runs, swirling and leaping into sun, is stone's refusal of the river, not the river. You can use that one on Valentine's Day, maybe. It's called What Any Lover Learns. So water is important to life, and arguably anywhere. Another hallmark of life on this planet is that it runs on sugar, and that sugars are made through photosynthesis. So that light is stored in chemical energy that is using sunlight to capture carbon dioxide and attach it to a 5-carbon sugar to make a 6-carbon sugar we call glucose. All chemical energy on Earth comes to us from that reaction, arguably making photosynthesis the most important reaction on the planet. And being a botany kind of guy, I sort of agree. Life runs on light. It's a solar economy after all. Life also works in cycles. You'll see this over and over again. Many of you probably in high school biology were introduced to things like the Krebs cycle, different biological metabolic pathways occur in feedback cycles and in loops. And there's ways of sensing this flow so that things don't build up in a sort of a linear progression. There are self-correcting, self-regulating feedback loops in life itself. So embedded in any organism, whether you're a prokaryote or a eukaryote, there are these feedback loops sensing inputs and outputs, which characterize pretty much life on this planet. And another thing is that learning is embedded in this process. How is learning embedded in this process? Replication in organisms throughout history is itself a feedback loop. Make a mistake? Well, that didn't work. But remember, there's no correction for that, only that those genes don't go on, you see. So learning is embedded in the process itself beyond the organism. So there is nothing that is really a failure, but a process. Like Edison, how did you feel about all those failures? I have a light bulb. So the organisms that exist now were dependent on all of the organisms that preceded them. And that this is a moving time frame. Another interesting feature is that life recycles everything it uses. There is not a biological compound for which there is not something that can degrade it and use it. There are even some compounds for which humans have made that organisms have figured out ways of breaking it down and utilizing it. Plastics and PCB. So for every molecule that life makes, there exists an enzyme somewhere to break it down. That's interesting. This also becomes a useful feature for biotechnology. If there's something we want to break down, cellulase in plant cell walls that we can make sugars out of for bioenergy, well, there's a cellulase. There's an enzyme in bacteria in the guts of termites that eat wood that degrade cellulose down into sugars. That's just one example. Life maintains by turnover. So it reorganizes. Nothing lasts forever. You are not the same person you were 2 years ago. Turnover creates this flexibility. In fact, there are these people who are exercise physiologists. And you've probably all heard the idea that exercise is good for you. Why? Why? At the molecular level, what is actually happening? It turns out that you're increasing turnover. Old molecules turn over. There are pathways that recognize old molecules and label them for their degradation. As a protein ages, it loses its functionality, and it is tagged for degradation down into its component amino acids so that it can be reassembled into a new molecule. Turns out that exercise accelerates this. Cells even eat parts of themselves. As a mitochondria ages, a cell will degrade its entire structure, dismantle it, and reutilize those parts. It's called autophagy, self-eating. So you are what you eat. That's an old phrase, but quite literally, you are what you eat. The carbon in you comes from the bread that you ate not too long ago. And that carbon came from the wheat that maybe grew in Kansas. And that wheat that grew in Kansas obtained its carbon either from the atmosphere or from the soil in which it grows, only to become you for a while, until it too is turned over to become part of the atmosphere again. So in fact, you are not you for very long. Our environment moves through us. Some parts of it stay around longer than others. Some of it is very ephemeral. Some cells turn over very quickly, liver, intestines, skin. Other cells like neurons and bone might exist for a lot longer. But really, you are what you eat. Metaphorically, you can realize that example. Metabolism, then, is a hallmark of life. We break down substances we consume, reconfigure them into who we are, utilize them, they become us for a while, and then they depart and leave and go back to the environment. Autopoiesis. The book by Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan, What is Life? She uses this word to characterize life on this planet. Autopoiesis. Auto, self. Poiesis, making, poein, as in poetry. Self-maintenance, self-preservation, self-continuance. All hallmarks of life characterized by this word, autopoiesis. Life tends to optimize rather than maximize. Life itself is said to be opportunistic in nearly every environment. But if you've got it, flaunt it. If it's costly and it can't easily be faked, it's sort of the bling that moves things forward evolutionarily. But basically, less will turn out to be better. Maximizing can lead to extinction, as in this example of an elk's horns. And this is to maximize functionality, functionability. Life is also opportunistic. If there's a way, life will find it. And it will take advantage of characteristics that ensure its success in that environment. Now be careful. Watch what I just said. This is not teleological. These organisms do not will themselves with these characteristics to survive. They survive there because if they didn't have these characteristics, they would not have survived. Take this example of a lodgepole pine. It closes and its seeds aren't released until there's a fire. If there's a fire, the resin melts, releasing the seeds into the ashes of the near fire, and the ashes also promote seedling growth. The lodgepole pine is therefore dependent on fire to ensure its success into future generations. Or the example of this bee orchid that mimics a female bee in both color and in its scent, enticing a male bee to have sex with the flower and pass on pollen from one flower to another. There's all kinds of these examples. Corn has used humans for its reproduction and has been very successful at doing that. Mitochondria have used all eukaryotic organisms for its reproduction. A selfish behavior. So getting back to Dawkins and the selfish gene, he would say that there are genes that encode replication, that ensure replication of DNA, that are using those organisms to replicate. But there are also genes that are in humans that are using the human to replicate, that have nothing to do with being a human. Ancient viruses have integrated into our genome and are hitching a ride, using the human genome to replicate and therefore go on. So life is opportunistic, we would say, in this way. Life also competes within a cooperative framework. Competes, cooperative. They seem juxtaposed in a strange sort of way. But now we're looking at things more with ecology eyeballs. Different organisms competing and cooperating. Every creature acts in its own interest, but the living world works through cooperation. Competition has been well cited. Nature is red in tooth and claw, survival of the fittest. And as it was actually Tennyson that quoted this, who trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature red in tooth and claw. That's actually from a much longer poem. And we're all familiar with survival of the fittest, and as I've already pointed out, don't misunderstand this. It's not you that we're really talking about. It doesn't care whether you're the baddest in the valley of the shadow of death, as some t-shirts might suggest. It's really survival of the organism and its population, and in fact its species. Survival of the fittest. And it really doesn't matter how fit you are, really. But you can read more from Darwin to expound on that. Cooperation facilitates survival at the species level. Call it coopetition. Life is interconnected and interdependent. We know this more and more these days. We're seeing the loss of habitat, and habitat destruction is now worldwide and rampant. Acreage of the Amazon rainforest lost daily is huge. Destruction of coral reefs and what that means to ocean ecology. So it's a network of interaction. And don't think that this doesn't matter. Destruction of coral reefs, you could say, it's okay, it's just a coral reef. We're all dependent on each other. I like that line, a butterfly beats its wings in the Amazon and changes the weather in Chicago. This is actually true in a weird sort of way. You can't remove anything without it having an effect. If you tweak something over there will be affected. Same thing is true at the molecular level, you know. Same thing is true at the cellular level. You tweak something over there and something over there will change. If you ever visit my office, I have a map of the whole metabolic pathways of life on my wall. It's really daunting to look at. And don't think that I have it memorized yet or anything, but it's an amazing thing. And if you think that you move something over there and this can possibly be benign, look at the interconnectedness of it all. So this is true at a molecular level, it's true at a cellular level, it's true at an organismal level, and it's true at the world level. Life changes. So consider your face. The basic features change very little over a year, hopefully, unless something catastrophic happens. But in that time, most of those original cells are turned over. All the molecules have been replaced. The fabric changes, but not the pattern. I'll get into this in a later lecture on developmental biology. But basically, the fabric changes. So true with the planet. I already told you about James Lovelock, the guy who was asked to analyze the atmosphere of different planets in the solar system and came back with a report to NASA that he thought that life had all of the characteristics of an organism on Earth, that the planet Earth had all the characteristics of an organism. The Earth behaves like an organism and shares all the qualities I just described. He called it Gaia, Mother Earth, and the interconnectedness of it all. You can't tweak something over there and hope something over there is not perturbed. This face you got, this here physog you carry around, you never picked it out for yourself at all, did you? This here physog, somebody handed it to you, am I right? Somebody said, here's yours, now go see what you can do with it. Somebody slipped it to you. It was like a package marked no goods exchanged after being taken away. This here physog, this face you got. Carl Sandburg. But what are the underlying principles? Some of these are also intimately involved in life. I already talked about emergence, with how a plasma membrane is generated, not by structurally putting together a molecule like DNA, but rather emerging out of combining phospholipids, and this is how it structures itself in water. Self-assembly. So, for example, if you were to take, by very simple rules, something like a triangle, an equilateral triangle, and you were to say add successively smaller triangles so that the middle of each side of the triangle is where you add a new one, like in this example here. What emerges exactly is a complex pattern that looks like a snowflake. So you look at the snowflake and you're enticed to believe, oh my goodness, it's so complicated. But actually it comes about from a very simple rule. Just add one equilateral triangle to the middle of another and just keep going with that, and this is what you end up with. Or in this example, keep exactly one dot width away from any neighbor and stay as close as possible to the center. And you end up with this array out of two very simple rules. So what looks like something that is very organized, tempting you to think, wow, how did that come about? Maybe something organized it. But if you just have two very simple physical rules and just say, you know, keep one dot width from any neighbor and stay as close as possible to the center, you get an ordered array. Similarly, when you look out at life itself, you look out there and you say, my gosh, it's so complicated. How could this possibly be? Well, when you start to understand the underlying self-emergent principles that give rise to something that looks as complicated as an oak tree, you can start to see that it is actually not as complicated as its appearance leads you to believe. So emergence is another characteristic of life. So in the case of a honeycomb, the emergent pattern might be like as if you were to say that assemble a group of spheres or cylinders so that they share the least amount of material possible. You end up with something that's like a honeycomb. Or allow one of two connected parallel surfaces to grow faster than the other. You end up with something that looks like a tendril that would climb a tree on a plant, or a nautilus shell, or the shell of a ram, the horn of a ram. So, you know, these emergent patterns create these very complex patterns in nature, but it's actually quite simple based on a few very low number of physical rules. So these complex biological structures may seem complex, but actually are the result of emergent patterns. Now let's consider behavior. It seems very complex. How did you all end up here today? You got up and you said, I'm going to get out of bed today, and eventually I'm going to go to this class. So how does this happen? Emergence of higher level behavior. Let's look first at termites. Termites, they make dollops of mud and plant stuff, and a chemical signal might say deposit a blob of mud there. Have you ever looked at a termite nest? It's a complicated, cut one in half sometimes. Well, no, I'd be messing them up, but it's a complex network of archways and hallways, tunnels, nesting areas. It's a city. How do they do that? Did somebody take out a blueprint and say, hey, you guys go over there and raise the girders, and you guys go over there and get some mud, and we're going to make this thing, here's the blueprint on how to make this arch. Emergent patterns. One said, spit here. There's a chemical signal. Other termites start spitting in other places and add deposits to the original one. This guy sends a chemical signal that says, oh, I'm going to drop my blob of mud there. And sooner or later, another chemical signal is emitted from the termite that says, spit on the side nearest to the neighboring column. And we make an archway. Two simple emergent pathways communicated by a chemical pheromone. Not like, hey, Jack, bring that piece of mud over here, we're going to make this arch over here. But just a chemical signal, spit nearest to your neighbor, and you make an archway. Consciousness. You think it's uniquely human? I doubt it. Lynn Margulis says it's a hallmark of life. If I were to take a petri dish and I would put a swimming modal bacteria, prokaryote, doesn't even have a nucleus, let alone a nervous system or a brain. And if I put a drop of acid over there and a drop of sugar over there, it will swim towards the sugar. One cell. How does it know how to do that? It's sensing, it's a chemical signal in a process that we call chemotaxis. All right, you're listening to me now. There's some hairs vibrating in your ear that are sending chemical signals to your brain, eliciting neurotransmitters that are chemicals, eliciting receptors, causing electrochemical signals, all in a mimic that allow you to hear me and actually think. And you decide to get up and move around, or you decide to do something later on tonight. We call this consciousness, but really isn't it a construct based on proteins and molecular activities? Where else is it? Where is consciousness? Is it in a single neuron in your brain? It has to have a biological construct. Is it any different, really, than the bacteria sensing that thing there, and this is just more of an elaborate structure. Or the termite that says spit here. How is communication accomplished throughout the biological world? Proteins, protein receptors, chemicals, sounds, environment, touch. How is this complicated? How is this accomplished? Are humans a part of nature? If that's true, then everything they do is natural. Is there anything that's unnatural? If that's true, then anything that humans do is an expression of nature. Where's John Locke when you need him? Is there anything that's not natural? Plastic? You say that's not natural? It's an expression of humans. There's some things that other organisms make that is pretty weird too. Are humans removed from nature? Is flying in a plane natural? Is the internet natural? Is New York City natural? What is our definition of natural? I don't mean to be a smartass about this, because this will come into play when we discuss how humans now are working with biology in terms of biotechnology. One of the questions people will ask, and maybe yourself later on, is that natural? Consider it in this context. There's an essay contest called This I Believe. I don't know if you've heard of it. On public radio, they put this out, encouraging people to submit. I tried my hand at one. It's short. You're requested only to submit 350 to 500 words on this is what you believe. Try it if you want. I think it's a bio, or isn't it a writing assignment for writing 104, I think? You're encouraged to say, this I believe, whatever it is you believe. And I think the only criteria for their exercise, or their challenge, is that it should be positive. You can't say something really, rah, 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 rah. It's not meant to be a rant, but, I believe in education, I believe in politics, I believe this, I believe, but make your case in 350 to 500 words. I've embedded into here a challenge I'd also give you. Try to describe life in 50 words or less. I'll show you mine. I believe in life. I believe we are a part of nature and not apart from nature. As such, we have everything to learn from life: who we are, how we came to be, and what is our role here. You see, I am a biologist, and biology is the study of life. Some people ask me when I became a biologist. I've been a biologist my whole life, for as long as I can remember. But I think it started when I was 5. I caught frogs in kindergarten during recess with my friend Joey Landgraf. That spring, I put frog eggs into a paper cup, brought them home, and put them into a goldfish bowl. They hatched into tadpoles. I watched them lose their tails, grow legs, and turn into frogs. Later, much later, I studied DNA, genetics, and the complexities of gene expression in plants, and I never lost my wonder or sense of awe or beauty for life. In fact, it's only deepened and increased. I now ask my students to consider the question, what is life? In 50 words or less. While it sounds simple, the diversity and complexity of life abounds with contradictions and exceptions that mock naive definitions. So I had to come up with my own, which I still consider insufficient, but evolving. It goes like this. Life is an information processing system capable of replication with variation, mediated by metabolism through biochemistry in an aqueous environment. and subjected to selection and the stochastic chance and necessity, consequential from the Big Bang, resulting in perceptions of beauty, knowledge, truth, love, consciousness, morality, self, and life. As a lifeist, I believe in life and the study of life. Through this lens, we can understand the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, and the Tao Te Ching. I believe that life would show us the superficial nature of racism, sexism, and other xenophobias. There are a lot of sayings and quotes about life, and I'm sure you know many of them. Life is short, life is precious, life is what you make it. But I still like the one by Abraham Lincoln, that in the end, it's not the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years. Because life teaches us also about death as a part of the process of life. I believe that life can also teach us everything we need to know about politics and government, war and peace, economics and money, art and artists, sex and love, family, relationships, and the mystery of children. We might also learn about frogs. I wonder where Joey is now. So that's mine. Try it yourself. You get 350 to 500 words, and I'll make that an extra credit component of the class.